So in this video we're going to be taking a look at the new Polysynth that was updated in the new version of Bitwig 2.0. So the biggest thing that changed about it is they removed a lot of the modulation sources and updated the mixer section of the device. So the device is laid out into 5 major sections. We have the 2 oscillators, the mixer section plus pitch, bend, and glide, the filter section, and the envelope section, and then last but not least, our global section where we have things like the volume, the velocity sensitivity, the panning, and then slots to add in MIDI effects, or as Bitwig calls it, note effects, or audio effects specifically to this device. What you might notice right off the bat is, in contrast to the previous version of Polysynth, for those of you who have used the earlier versions of Bitwig, is that we've lost a lot of the modulation sources that we had before. So we no longer have built-in LFOs, we only have 2 envelope generators, and that's it. Which this is kind of the new thing with Bitwig 2.0, of that there aren't LFOs in anything unless we add them to it through the new modulators. So to add modulators to the Polysynth, we first have to expose the modulation section, or the modulator section with this little icon here, the circle and the arrow. And then we start off with just 3 slots, but once we filled those 3 slots, another 3 slots will appear, and we just click on the Add button to pop open the browser. Then we can add in any of these types of modulators that we want. So we'll look at these modulators in another video, but if I needed an LFO in the Polysynth, I could just add the LFO, and just like we used to be able to, click on the modulation routing and then set however I want that modulator to modulate things, and then click on the little expansion arrow to get into the settings for that specific modulator that's been now added to our Polysynth device. So we're going to go ahead and delete that out of there by right-clicking and saying delete and hiding our modulators, because in this video we're not too worried about modulators. We're really just worried about the Polysynth in general. So the Polysynth in general is a subtractive synthesizer, meaning that we start by creating a complex sound using its 2 built-in oscillators, and then we use its filter to simplify or subtract that complex sound and focus it down to just the elements we want to. But the Polysynth is a little bit more complex than that. Other than just having 2 oscillators, which we have on the left-hand side, and a filter here, plus 2 envelopes, one that's hardwired to the filter's cutoff frequency, another that's hardwired to the amplitude or the gain or the volume output of the Polysynth, plus some other parameters over here. We also have this kind of interesting mixing section, which is how are these 2 oscillators combined together. And they can be mixed together, combined together in a number of different ways, which we'll look at in a second. But let's just start with the oscillators. So I'll just talk about one of these oscillators because they're both exactly the same. We've just got 2 of the same thing that can have their own settings. So we start with, on the top of each oscillator is this really nice visual feedback of the waveform that we're currently generating. So we can see by default oscillator 1 up top here starts by producing a saw wave. So if I play a note, we get a saw wave. And I'm going to go ahead and bring in an oscillator here, or not an oscillator, I'm sorry, a oscilloscope, so we can visualize what we're doing here. Let's have that triggered by input A, and time division follows the key. Then we can go ahead and collapse down our settings. Oops. There we go. Let's get that a little bit bigger. There we go. So we can see what we're making here. So starting with a saw wave, then we can change the pitch of that by going up or down by 7 semitones or perfect fifth. Or going up or down by octave. Down to where it gets super flappy. Then next to that, we've got the ability to control the shape of our oscillator, so morphing from a saw wave to a square wave, which is the octave up. You'll notice that we start with just 1 saw wave, and as I morph over, we start to get 2 square waves for every one of those saws. If I go the opposite direction, we get a saw wave that is an octave up from what we had in the middle. And underneath that, we have the pulse width for our shape. So if we're starting in the center there, we won't hear or see any difference unless I go one way or the other. And now as I change the pulse width, you can see that it's changing the ratio between the positive and the negative. If we go over to the saw, we're changing the location of that second peak. And of course, all of these can be modulated by one of our modulators. So if we go back to the basic shape and double click or right click and say set to default value, we're back to our original settings. And we come along to the sub oscillator that each one of these oscillators has, which brings in a square wave, which is the octave down. So morphing back and forth between whatever shape we've set up with the shape and pulse width and a sub oscillator, which is unfortunately only a square wave. It's not affected by our shape knob. But it too has its own pulse width option below. Then we've also got a sync control, which allows us to synchronize or use another oscillator, kind of an internal or hidden oscillator, to reset the waveform or the phase of our current oscillator, which is kind of a crazy concept to think about, but if we just visualize this, hang on to this peak here and this peak here, as I start to increase the sync, you'll see that gradually those two peaks that I just pointed out to remain, but more kind of sub-peaks crop up in between that. So if we listen to the results of that, we start with so the timbral results really kind of shifts, and it almost sounds like we're glissandoing up, but the fundamental kind of stays ghostly there. And then we can set that to always re-trigger the syncing oscillator every time we start a new note or not, which at the moment doesn't make a whole lot of difference whether that's on or off. But once we engage the next section, we'll come back to this and you'll really hear a difference. So the last couple of knobs here and their corresponding sliders underneath controls the stereo width and the unison detune of this oscillator. So each of the two oscillators of Polysynth can have up to 16 copies of itself simultaneously sounding. So by default, there's just one copy of this first oscillator happening, which sounds like. So let's bring that sync back down. But if I start to increase the number of voices or the number of copies of this oscillator that's simultaneously being produced, the sound gets thicker, and both these two knobs up top here will become active. So if I switch to just two, they're both lit up. If you're wearing headphones, you'll immediately notice that now we've got a really wide stereo sound, and this dial controls that. So whether or not it's stereo or mono, moving back to stereo. And then the unison controls the amount of detune or the spread in terms of frequency between the two copies of this oscillator, that we could start with them perfectly in tune. And here's where you can hear that re-trigger starting to take effect, especially if you've got headphones on. And sometimes the left sounds dominant, other times the right sounds dominant, and that has to do with the phase relationships between the left and the right channels. That sometimes the left channel is kind of being phase canceled by the right channel. So if I start to increase that detune, now you can hear the left and the right channels are slightly out of tune with one another. So I start to add in more voices or more simultaneous copies of this first oscillator. This resulting sound gets thicker, thicker and thicker. We've got up to 16 possible copies or voices of this sound that we can have. We can bring them back into being closer in tune with one another. And then reducing the stereo width. And reducing the number of voices. And that's what each one of these oscillators is capable of doing. So we've got control of pitch, whether that be up or down by a perfect fifth, control of the octave, control of the shape, morphing back and forth between a basic saw, a saw that's up an octave, or a square that's down the octave and its pulse width. The sub-oscillator morphing between either our basic oscillator or the octave below at a square wave and its pulse width. Then the synchronization, which we can just kind of vaguely understand as timbral shifts in the frequency and whether or not it re-triggers. And then the unison and number of voices or number of simultaneous copies of this sound and how out of tune or in tune they are, and the stereo width of that, which last but not least we hadn't talked about panning this oscillator left and right. And I guess we also forgot to talk or come back to that re-trigger amount. So if we quickly go back to a nice wide, slightly out of tune 16 voice copy of this thing, and let's go slightly more square and change that pulse width, and then change the sync amount. Now you'll notice that when we don't have re-trigger turned on, it's not restarting this sync oscillator every time we start a new note. It's just kind of endlessly running in the background, which means when I play and hold the note, the result sounds relatively stable. Though you can hear some subtle motion, but for the most part it just kind of drones along. Now as soon as I tick on that re-trigger, what's going to happen is it's going to re-trigger the synchronization oscillator for all currently 6 copies of oscillator 1 that we have running slightly out of tune with one another. So we're going to hear them all start in tune with that oscillator, sync oscillator, syncing them all, and gradually, because they're slightly out of tune, we're going to have all those out of tune oscillators falling out of sync. And again, we're saying sync way too many times here, but all falling out of sync with that synchronized oscillator, which is going to give us this really kind of like pew sound. So here again is our sound without re-trigger turned on for our sync oscillator. And here it is turned on. So you'll notice two things. One, that pew sound, but also now as I go back and I play more notes, because we're resetting the phase of all the oscillators involved, every time I trigger a note, we're getting a punchier or more consistent attack quality to our synthesizer. Oops. And if I had that turned on or turned off, we'll hear that that attack quality isn't quite so consistent. Not quite as punchy or snappy as when this is turned on. So that is what each oscillator can do. So the second oscillator is just an exact mirror of that with its own parameter controls. All right, so let's return everything to its default values here. Sync back, that back, that back, and that back. Cool. So that we can start looking at the mixer section. So this mixer section controls how the two oscillators plus our noise source are generated together. It all starts with this 1 and 2 slider right here, which controls the mix, or depending upon how we've got it set up top here, how these two oscillators are blending together. In its default state, with mix selected, we're slowly crossfading between oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, which currently oscillator 1, set that back to the basic saw wave, is set to a saw wave, and oscillator 2 is set to a square wave, but up the octave. So as I hold a note, crossfade, and back again, we go back and forth between the two values. So we can change the function or how these two are combined together by changing or selecting a different oscillator blend mode up top. The next option over is neg for linear mix with oscillator 2, negated for phase cancellation, which is fancy talk for saying that neither of these two can affect each other in a noise canceling or negative way. They can only reinforce one another, so we don't lose potential volume depending upon the phases of these two oscillators, which is very similar to mix. It's just in mix we have some phase offset cancellation issues between the two oscillators. So then wipe gets a little bit more bizarre from your usual crossfade in that it's wiping from the positive version of oscillator 1 to the negative version of oscillator 2. So if we look at that in the oscillator, on the oscilloscope, what our oscilloscope is showing us here is the air pressure changes of audio. So if you think about it, sound at the end of the day is air pressure changes over time, whether or not that's just between the little bit of air between your earbuds and your eardrums, or the air between you and the speakers in a concert hall, or whatever it is. It's all about air pressure changes over time. So what this oscilloscope is showing us is time running left to right, and then positive air pressure and negative air pressure on the vertical axis, and that center line representing no air pressure changes over time. And when we're in the wipe mode, it's forcing oscillator A to only go back and forth between no air pressure changes over time to negative air pressure change, where then it forces oscillator 2 to be operating in the other spectrum, and then we can wipe or crossfade back and forth between those two options. So to compare that first with the mix, here's what this looks like. Let's zoom in a little bit. And then crossfading back, we slowly morph over to a saw or a square. So when I go to wipe, now we'll start with oscillator 1, the saw, but strictly in the negative. And as I wipe over to the square, we gradually morph to a square, but we also gradually morph to the positive arena. So that's the wipe version. Then we've got amplitude modulation, where we've got the amplitude modulation of oscillator 1 from oscillator 2. So we're using oscillator 2 as an amplitude modulation source, so controlling the volume of oscillator 1. So if we start over here, and let's drop this one down several octaves, and then slowly crossfade or slowly increase the amount that oscillator 2 is modulating oscillator 1. Go down a few octaves. So a little hard to hear here, but the results, maybe if we morph over to the there we go. Amplitude of oscillator 1 being modulated by oscillator 2. So then we've got sine, which applies polarity of oscillator 1 on oscillator 2. So essentially the opposite, where now we've got oscillator 1 working against oscillator 2, and we can kind of see that. Let's see. Yeah. So it's very similar to amplitude modulation, but instead we're hearing the results of oscillator 2 being modulated similar to amplitude of oscillator 1. Hopefully the graphs there make a little bit more sense than the way I'm explaining it. Again, music maker, not a mathematician. But yeah, slightly different sound as we change the pulse. Get some really interesting results. And again, all of this is just changing the way that one knob mixes these two oscillators together. So last but not least, we've got max, which takes or only allows the maximum value of either oscillator 1 or oscillator 2. So it's constantly comparing the current, we could conceive of it as air pressure changes over time, the current amplitude or air pressure change value of the oscillators 1 and oscillators 2, and only allows the one that is currently louder than the other to pass through depending upon our current settings here. So let's go back to simpler setup. So as I morph, we can hear and occasionally see the sound of oscillator 2 when it's louder than oscillator 1 or higher in amplitude passing through instead of oscillator 1. So those are all the different mix modes for how we can crossfade or combine oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. The next knob over is the noise, which allows us to crossfade between how we've combined together oscillators 1 and 2 and a noise source. Which you can hear is still influenced by how we've got these set to be mixed together. Then the next knob over allows us to perform audio rate modulation of the filter's cutoff frequency, which is this section here. So as I increase this knob, we're increasing the amount that the output of these two oscillators is modulating our filter's cutoff frequency. So let's get some more interesting sounds going here. So, some really strange things that can already start happening with what we've got going on here. We're crossfading, but not just simply crossfading. We're using some kind of mathematical equations to determine which oscillator is making sound at which point, and potentially mixing that in with some noise, and then using that to maybe control the filter's cutoff frequency, which we can then just get into this whole weird world of sound, and then blending in some filter resonance and things like that. So already things are getting wickedly crazy, and we haven't even begun to talk about modulators of any kind. So underneath these three knobs, we then have a basic drive, which is boosting the signal as it's fed into the filter. We then have a basic high pass or no filter whatsoever on the driven signal. So what portion of this are we driving? Let's go high pass. And here we're getting just a little bit more of the top end coming out of the sound that we're generating with our two oscillators. So we can drive that before it passes into the filter and apply some resonance to that drive. Or nothing. Then down at the bottom we've got our pitch for transposing both oscillators up or down, the glide, which can be affected by this little tab over here by glide on legato only. So start by setting the amount of glide or glide time between two notes. can hear that if I play one note, I release that note and I play another note, it still remembers the old note even though it's no longer sustaining. Whereas if I turn on this FP button for glide only on legato, now if I play a note, release that note and play another note, there is no glide between those two notes unless I play a note, continue to hold that note before I press the next note, then it glides between those two notes. So that's what FP stands for over there in the glide. And then the FB, not the FP, the FB stands for feedback, the amount that these oscillators are fed back in to the drive circuit before passing along to our filters. So just a little bit more boost. Which can just take a sound that's already really dirty and make it even dirtier. So that's the mixer section. How are things combined together? And then kind of tagged along in the bottom here, do we have any pitch, glide, or feedback in all of that? Which brings us to the filter section. We choose up top here our basic filter shapes. Then we've got our filter's cutoff frequency. Let's go back here to a more basic tone. Resonance of that. Which can't quite self-oscillate. Can certainly get crunchy, but can't quite self-oscillate. Then we've got a filter distortion circuit with several different wave shaping algorithms. I really like RIP. Then we've got how much does the note that we're playing affect our filter's cutoff frequency. So as I play higher notes, does the filter's cutoff frequency open up? Or as I play lower notes, does it roll down? Or does it stay totally stagnant regardless of what note that I'm playing in? So that's just setting our kind of like key sympathy or key modulation of our filter frequency. Which I think it's a little odd that Bitwig still left this in there because we have a modulator which does exactly the same thing, and it kind of seems like that was their whole approach, was let's strip out all the modulators and let's only let you use the ones that you actually want to use in a synthesizer. So I think it's a little strange that this one's still in there, but maybe they just decided it's something that you need always, so let's just include it in our synthesizer. So that's what that dial does. Then the next one over is how much does our filter's built-in envelope generator, down here at the bottom, how much does that influence the filter's cutoff frequency? So right now it's got instantaneous attack, a slowish decay down to no sustain and no release. So when I play this note, it starts where it is, but as I increase the amount of envelope influence on the filter's cutoff frequency, you can hear that opening and closing faster. And we've got underneath that a little dial where we can set the envelope curve to be either more or less exponential. And then underneath that, we've got our envelope sections, one that's dedicated to the filter's cutoff frequency, another that's dedicated to the amplitude envelope. But both of these, if we just click on their little modulation routing button, we can route them to whatever we want to, either one of these. So again, filter and amplitude. So if I want a longer release, I can just increase the release time, or a longer attack, increase the attack time. Or shorten it. And then we're almost to the end. We've got a spot for dropping in some note effects, things like arpeggiators or chord builders or scalers or things like that. A section for dropping in audio effects that are specifically modulating the polysynth. The ability to make it a mono synth by turning on mono, and the ability to single trigger envelopes. So the envelopes only trigger with the first note that we play and then won't re-trigger until we release all held notes and trigger another one. Which I believe has to be only works when we're in monophonic mode. Then how much velocity influence is there on our gain? So softer versus harder notes, do they actually come out quieter or louder? And then the global panning, is our polysynth coming out the left or the right? And our global volume. And that is the polysynth. So what we'll look at in future videos is these modulators, as well as we'll take a look at some kind of building up of sounds with the polysynth. So hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe below. Please let me know if you've got any questions or anything you want me to talk about in more detail. And hopefully this gets you going with the Polysynth. It's a pretty incredible synthesizer for what a tiny little package it comes in. So thanks again.